Okay, so as you probably noticed on Monday, I am once again sick. I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon. So I'm going to do a video, sorry, of the PowerPoint that I was going to do in class, which is actually from von Sciver's chapter 17, The Renaissance, New Science, and Religious Wars in Europe, 1450 to 1750. And the basic reason I want to go over this is because this is kind of foundational to the whole question of what intellectualism is. It has to do with that percentage of the population that can devote itself to the study of abstract thinking, particularly the sciences, mathematics, etc. And I've tried to make the point repeatedly in class that when we talk about Europe, Europe's behind everywhere else. In this particular segment, a lot of what we're talking about is stuff that the Europeans brought back with them when they went off to the Crusades, when they went off and encountered other peoples through trade. Their reinvigoration and reinterest in intellectualism comes from both suddenly having an increase in income due to a certain extent with the reorganization of trade. So it's no coincidence that Italy, or the Italian city states, which were already dealing with the Ottoman Empire in the cross Mediterranean trade, would be one of the reasons why the Renaissance starts there. It's Rome, and they're looking at, or Rome is in it, and they're looking at the classical writings of the Greek and Romans, which they have kind of rediscovered by way of connecting with the Arabs and the Indians and other Middle Eastern peoples. And B, they're one of the first places to begin to see the increase in wealth through trade. So they have now created a percentage of the population that can spend its time looking at intellectual pursuits, right? And we've talked about this from the beginning of the course that you have to have a surplus of food or a surplus of wealth in some capacity to allow this to happen. So with the Italians, it's going to start in the 1200s and it's going to spread backwards slowly as trade increases, moving backwards through the rest of Western Europe. So I kind of wanted to start here. Um, I've already tried to bring, here's your urban population in Europe in 1700. Now notice this is 1700, so this is after the Columbian Exchange, which means they've already brought in many of the new food products from the Western Hemisphere. They're going to allow them to create even more surplus. Notice your big cities that have developed, Paris, London, Amsterdam, Naples, um, large urban populations, which of course are where you're going to get the ability for people to spend time studying and doing things that are not directly associated with either producing food or making money. All right. So the Renaissance was driven by the rediscovery of classical texts. Now, again, this is not necessarily um, digging down into the ruins of Rome and finding books. It's more like going over to Europe or going past Europe over into the Middle East and India, where those texts still existed. We get the development of what is called humanism, which is the growing belief, to put it succinctly, that humans have more influence on things than we realize, that you can actually look at making human life better. At the end of this particular version of the PowerPoint, I have linked a number of videos, particularly from Crash Course European History, which are really good. And John Green in one of them does a really good job discussing what humanism is, and I encourage you to look at that. The printing press, which again is not new. We talked about this. The Chinese have had it for like 500 years before it is developed by Gutenberg in Europe. But once it gets there, Gutenberg's advantage is that he figures out how to do it in Latin as well as in vernaculars. So people in Europe could actually read it, unlike in China, where of course it was principally in Han Chinese. So this is going to drive the distribution of books and ideas as people are able to read more stuff. We also in this era, particularly starting in Italy, with the rise of Machiavelli and the growth of the power of local princes like the various families, the de' Medici in Florence, See, the idea of the state as its own entity. Now, I've tried to get you to this with this discussion of the development of bureaucracy, that the idea of bureaucracy both ties itself to the king, but also makes itself independent, so that things become more consistent. As kings die, the bureaucracy still operates. It's just that now it's going to a new king. But this also begins to develop a proto form of nationalism where people begin to think more in terms of how they identify with this idea of the geographical region that they're in, shared languages, shared culture, as opposed to just being tied directly to whoever their current overlord or aristocrat is. And that's also going to begin to be part of the breakdown of the feudal system. All right. The Baroque period emerges in 1600. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it because the Baroque is going to overlay with the Enlightenment. All right, so Renaissance art, when we think of art, when we think of the Renaissance, that's principally what we think of, art and architecture. But that's because that's a reflection of what we have today. I would point out that if you take a gender history course, one of the big questions, and that's again one of the questions that Green brings out in his Renaissance, was it a thing, is who was actually affected by the Renaissance? Were the common people, were women, um, were the poor affected by the Renaissance? It principally seems to be something that was limited to the elite and the upper classes. And in fact, part of that is because when we start looking at art, it's beautiful, no question about it. But it becomes a mechanism for the magnification of the power of the state or the papacy. When we look at a lot of Renaissance art, it's stuff that popes paid for to make the Vatican beautiful, to demonstrate the power and wealth of the church. And kings are going to do the same thing. It's going to be a function of the state to demonstrate to people, here's the power and the glory of what we have, but also is something that most people are never going to see. The actual cost of producing art is problematic because the tools are expensive. So this is another thing that is going to limit it to people who are principally wealthy as being the artists. It is, though, going to become foundational to the development of what is referred to as the new sciences. Now, to start with, we talk about the scientific revolution in Europe. A lot of what we're talking about is the recreation of the science that existed under the Greeks and Romans. At first, during the scientific revolution, it's actually just redoing the experiments the Greeks and the Romans did. But as it progresses, and they discover that these things work, you begin to get people like Copernicus who began to question the idea here of the helios or the Earth-centric world. You get developments in mathematics. Again, a lot of that, though, is driven by the encounters with Indians and the fact that they've already developed zero, which leads to the ability to do calculus and then later physics. So this is going to progress also in Europe. They're going to kind of catch up. Um, so the big conflict in Europe about these things, and part of what kind of stops the development of science, even in places like India and the Islamic caliphates, is the conflict with God, literally. The idea that if you start being able to explain these things, then you're taking away the power of God and the glory of God. So church leaders uniformly, whether they were Muslim, whether they were Christian, whether they were Catholic, whether they were Hindu, began to push back against the expansion of science to the point of explaining things that they believed were totally in God's purview. All right. Newton, one of our penultimate astronomers and physicians, in fact, one of the first physicists, is going to be the one who's actually going to give us the first laws of physics. And that's going to be in the 1700s during the Enlightenment. So the scientific revolution connects the Renaissance through the Age of Discovery, through the Enlightenment. And that's how long it's going to go on and the way it's going to develop. And all of these things are interactive, which is part of why I want you to understand how long this takes and why it's not necessarily just that it's European. It's that these guys are drawing ideas from other parts of the world as well. I mentioned this the other day when we're looking at the PowerPoint on on slavery and the expansion of the Western Hemisphere. Martin Waldseemüller's map in 1507. Again, notice his Africa. Notice how well developed this part is, Eurasian Africa, but how underdeveloped the Western Hemisphere is. All right. So one of the other things that science does is it becomes state sponsored. As kings begin to try more and more to do away with feudalism and to distance themselves from um, their aristocrats and trying to cut them out of the loop, they understand the power that science gives them. So they begin to encourage research in sciences by awarding grants effectively to people who are doing things that are beneficial to the crown or to the state, literally. Royal societies develop in London and in Paris, and then later on in other parts of Europe. These were literally sponsored by kings and royals, where they gave grants to scientists who were working on specific things. One of the big consistent ones is the search for ways to um, determine longitude so that they could figure out where ships were in the ocean and how to anticipate when they were going to get there. But other things come out of this, like the vacuum, steam power, which of course is going to lead ultimately in the late 1700s, early 1800s to the Industrial Revolution. These were all things that, in many ways, monarchs were looking for because it would give them even more power to distance themselves from their aristocrats. Notice these centers of learning expand from 1500 to 1770. Um, many more. And part of this, again, is the process of urbanization. It's the growing wealth in Western Europe because of their control of the resources of Africa and the Western Hemisphere, the money that's coming in from there, and because of the availability of new food substances based on the Columbian Exchange. The Enlightenment itself begins in northwestern Europe. It's going to start in around the late 1600s, early 1700s. And this will be the thing that begins to distance Western Europe from the sciences that everybody else have had. If you're actually looking at the one pinnacle moment or the one pinnacle thing that does kind of say, okay, Western Europe has arrived now as a competitor and perhaps developing the advantage on the rest of the world, it's going to be the scientific method. The idea that you can, because it's a big thing that comes out of the Enlightenment in terms of science, not in terms of the humanities and philosophy and economics, but in terms of science, it's the idea that you can do experiments and write down your process of doing them so other people can recreate them. With the idea being that the more people who conduct the same experiment with the same conditions and the same thing happens, you begin to get to a uniform theory and then eventually a law. The idea that this is a constant in the world. This would be Newtonian gravity. This would be many of the other things that we take for granted today. But the scientific theory is the big thing behind this, or the scientific method. And that's Descartes and Bacon. Descartes, particularly with his idea that you can't trust what you see, taste, or feel, that the only reliable knowledge was logic. And this is part of the repeat the same experiment in the same way over and over and see if you get different results. Because if you get different results, that's a sign of the senses. That's not a sign of um, of actual logic, right? All right. So in the course of this, of course, other things are happening. We are seeing a shift away from feudalism. Part of that comes with the military. We've seen the growth of gunpowder, the spread of gunpowder from China over Central Europe and now into Western Europe. And that's a big part of what kings and other guys are going to be paying for, is for scientists to figure out literally the physics of firearms, the physics of gunpowder. And this is part of what's going to bring places like Prussia into competition with larger developing monarchies and empires like Spain and Portugal and Britain and France, because Prussia is going to be one of the main ones to figure out how to effectively use smaller gunpowder weapons effectively. Armies are going to grow larger, and now they're going to be paid by the state, not by the aristocrats, and in some respects, not even by the king. So armies are going to have their loyalty to the state now, and that's going to begin to shift the dynamics of how governments operate. Centralization is going to occur, so more and more smaller states are going to become absorbed into larger ones. This is a process we've seen throughout the course. But I'm really sorry, this is why I'm doing it this way and not trying to do it in class. Only large states would have the manpower and the wealth, of course, to maintain standing armies, which are basically armies that are trained constantly, who are constantly reinforced with gunpowder and weapons, and who are taught how to fight in specific manners. They're professionally trained soldiers. And this is a new thing. This is going to be a big foundational shift in how um, kingdoms are going to expand and operate, and how we're going to get to effectively what now we think of as modern warfare, right? All right. The scientific revolution and the Renaissance are both also going to be foundational to the Protestant Reformation, and you can't really get past understanding what's going on in Europe without a working understanding of the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church has been criticized for centuries. I've tried to make that point in class repeatedly that Christendom of the Church has gone on, well, since its beginning, but certainly in the 900s with the split between the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox Church over the iconoclastic issue, the Cathars in the 1200s, and then other notable people who have stepped up and tried to explain that the church needs to clean up its act, that the whole thing with indulgences and the wealth of the papacy is undermining the literal principles of the religion itself, especially Christ's idea about taking care of the poor. And it also is because of the competition between the papacy and the rulers of kingdoms who are trying to diminish the power of the church within their territories. So it doesn't help when the papacy itself has the schism that starts in the 1300s, the papal schism between effectively, to try to summarize it shortly, a conflict in who can determine who the pope is. And this comes because there wasn't actually a process in the Catholic Church for doing this. Effectively, the bishops got together and decided who was going to be the pope. There were a bunch of prestigious bishops in Rome who were from the local Roman city-states, who had won their positions basically by buying them, who wanted the pope to be someone from their group, versus the French king, who was one of the most powerful at the time, who wanted one of his French archbishops to be the pope. And so effectively, the French king offers to create a new papal residence in Avignon, which was a French city close to Italy, basically, even though Italy's not unified, it was close to what would have been the border with Upper Italy. And so the majority of the voters voted for the French guy to become the Pope. But that shifts power to Avignon, where people become disgruntled because they think the French king is dictating papal policy, which then leads, after the death of one of the prelates, to a split between the various factions, with each group voting for a different pope and each one declaring their pope to be the right one. So for a while you get a split between the papacy, where you get one pope who is in Avignon and one pope who is in Rome, and they each excommunicate the other and excommunicate all the followers of the other. This goes on for like 20, 30 years, and at one point you get where you've got like 6 actual people who are claiming to be pope. So it really overall leads the general population of Western Europe not to trust the church. And this in turn begins to lead to more and more questions about the church. Even though the papacy is reunited in the 1400s and they're back to just one pope, the scarring of that leads to even more questions and challenges to the power of the church that the pope tries to handle by effectively sending out papal inquisitions to catch people who are accused of these heresies of criticizing the church and having them burned at the stake. This is what happens to Jan Hus. As I mentioned before, John Wycliffe is protected because the king basically arrests him and throws him in a dungeon under under the Tower of London, basically refusing to let him communicate with anybody outside of the king himself because he's a friend of the king's. But it also leads ultimately to Martin Luther, who is we call him a monk. He wasn't technically a monk. He was actually a theologian. He was someone who taught theology at the University of Wittenberg, to challenge the authority of the church to sell indulgences. Now, that's where it starts. There were 195 theses. The indulgences take up about a quarter of them, but there are other things he protested as well. But the indulgences were at the heart of it, the idea that you could buy your way into heaven if you paid X amount of money to the papacy. The church and God would forgive you for even some of the highest sins, like killing somebody, simply because you had enough money to buy your way or to give money to the papacy. And part of what that money was going to was a lot of this art of the Renaissance. So there's actually a cycle. It's actually all kind of related in here. Um, so Luther survives because he has the advantage of being in a part of Germany where the prince he was living under was fighting against literally Charles V. Now, Charles V was the King of Spain. And this is the Spain of the Spanish Empire after taking control of the Western Hemisphere. This is Spain at its most wealthy. Charles had inherited the control of much of Central Western Europe, the German principalities, Austria, parts of the Netherlands, the whole big area in that, as well as Spain, as well as the Western Hemisphere. I mean, he had this phenomenally huge empire. And his main goal was to defeat the Muslims in the Holy Land. What he really, really wanted and what he spent his life trying to do was to win the Holy Land back. And he was spending a tremendous lot of money trying to do that. And part of what he wanted to do was to unify all of Germany and Austria. Well, Germany and Austria were part of what was then called the Holy Roman Empire. And the way they were structured was that they did not have a specific, they weren't unified under one monarchy. They had a elected body, they had a king, but the king was voted on for life by what are called the elector states, and these were the largest of the principalities. And the whole idea of this literal Holy Roman Confederacy was that they bonded together under the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire for external protection, for the benefits of trade, where they could trade as one block for the benefit of all of them, as opposed to each one of them singularly, and for, again, for protection from external conquest. Charles V wanted to be named the Holy Roman Empire emperor, and he wanted it to become a hereditary position. And as the King of Austria, he thought he had the right to do this. So a number of the more significant princes were pushing back against this, and one of them was the one that Martin Luther was being protected by. And effectively, while this particular prince wasn't all about the idea of Protestantism, he was about the idea of obstructing Charles V and his power grab. So he protected Martin Luther, allowing Martin Luther time to grow a very significant following and to start the Lutheran Church. It doesn't help that John Calvin was an expatriate of France. He had been kicked out of France. He was going through a similar civil war over Protestant reformations as with the Huguenot. Calvin moved to Switzerland, where the city-states there allowed for a certain amount of religious toleration, and founded Calvinism. A guy named Zwingli also did a similar thing. And then John Knox, who adopted a particularly Scottish form of Calvinism, had a big influence on Scotland and then later on England as well. And of course, we all know the story of Henry VIII, who broke with the Church of England principally because he wanted a divorce so they could marry Anne Boleyn. Now, again, there are politics involved in Henry VIII's situation too, because the woman he was divorcing, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess, and of course, related to Charles V, who had influence on the Pope, and who the Pope basically said, no, you can't divorce her, thus leading to Henry VII's break with the Catholic Church and declaring the Church of England to stop at him. So Protestantism spreads for a variety of different reasons throughout Western Europe, but it leads to a long, long number of wars. The Catholics fight back, of course, what is called the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Ignatius Loyola and the Society of Jesus, they develop new fraternal brotherhoods um, whose goals are to teach Catholicism to others. The Dominicans and the Jesuits both see it as their path to teach, particularly the heathens in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa and in China and India, the way of Catholicism, and attempts to expand the Catholic population as they lose elements to Protestantism. And they also make it a policy to defend the protection of the church through any means necessary, even violence. So by 1580, here's your map of where Protestantism is spread. What you see in France here, these are areas that were carved out by the Treaty of Nantes to allow Protestantism particularly, and to be fair, Protestants aren't tolerant of each other either. So when we talk about spreading Protestantism, we're talking about spreading one particular form of Protestantism. It's now just down to the Huguenot in France, that being the only one that's tolerated, but it is a form of Calvinism. We see the Spanish Netherlands, who are going to adopt both Lutheranism and Calvinism in different areas. England is going to adopt, I'm so sorry, the Church of England, but there's going to be competition with it as well, which is a big part of when we talk about the movement of like people like the Puritans to the Western Hemisphere. They're people who are trying to purify the Church of England because they don't see it as anything other than Catholicism light. So yeah, it's going to be different ways in different areas, but again, your predominantly Catholic areas, again, of Italy, Spain, big sections of France, Ireland. These are going to be areas that the Catholic Church is still going to wield a tremendous amount of control. All right. So again, this is going to lead to about 300 years, literally, some of the most destructive civil wars in Europe, Western Europe, and those wars are going to spread throughout the Western Hemisphere as well. It's not a coincidence that politics is going to get tied up in this as well, as many local rulers are going to adopt Protestantism as a mechanism to unify their people against Catholic monarchs. And this is part of what the Dutch War of Independence from Spain is about. It's going to be a big part of the Civil War in England that's going to go on throughout literally the 1600s. It's going to be used as a weapon for kings to create absolute monarchies by arguing the Catholic position that the king is the ultimate controller of the protection of the people because God puts him there, versus parliamentary rule, which is going to develop in places like Britain and in parts of Northern Europe, where the power of the king and queen is going to be limited by a parliamentary body who is going to argue for the protection of one main religion, but sometimes and in some places a form of religious tolerance. Now, it's going to be iffy, and that's going to be one of the big problems that the British are going to go through throughout the 1600s, is where do we get to that line of religious toleration. Probably one of the worst and main wars was the 30 Years' War, which literally lasted, surprisingly, for 30 years, from 1619 to 1649. And it is, even though it's called a religious war, it is literally a political war, because what ends up happening by the end, there are three phases to the war. And what ends up by the end is that Catholic powers are siding with Protestant powers in order to limit the power of Spain and France, because of the big fear that coming out of this war, Europe's going to be dominated by Spain or France, and neither side particularly, and a bunch of these other coalitions don't want that. They want a more broken up Europe. The ultimate thing that comes out of this is that in the German principalities, again, Germany's not unified, is that there will be religious freedom, but what that literally means is that whoever controls the principality controls the religion. It's not going to be religious toleration. It's going to be that if you live in an area where the prince practices the religion you practice, you're going to be safe there. If he doesn't, then you're going to need to move somewhere else. So the ultimate goal, though, was to create a balance of power between all of the arriving states in Europe. So this is Europe in 1648. And again, very complicated as to how this is all going on. It's also not a coincidence that in this period we're going to see the rise of Enlightenment thinking because people are so frustrated with these religious wars that they begin to question the right of the state to determine religion. And the Enlightenment's big and broad and all-encompassing. Enlightenment thinking is going to touch pretty much every major aspect of society, from economics to politics to war to religion. So in this respect, what I'm talking about when I talk about the influence of the religious wars on the Enlightenment, it's going to have to do with the relationship between the state and the people. It's because of the religious wars that many Enlightenment thinkers begin to think that there should be a wall between the state and religion, that people should be allowed to practice whatever religion they want to with no influence from the state. And again, a big part of that is because of the religious wars. You're going to get absolutism in France, particularly under Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was going to break down aristocracy and create one of the most uniform bureaucracies in Western Europe in this period. And a big part of that is because he grew up afraid of his nobility. And this is in a period after the Civil Wars or during the Civil Wars. Where he kept getting kidnapped by various factions while he was a child, who wanted to control him and through him the religion of the state and the power in the state. So basically, even before he technically came to his majority, when he took over, he began the process of cutting the aristocracy out of power and developing it all to himself. Versailles was a manifestation of this. He built this huge palace in the outskirts of France, with the idea being that it was large enough for all of his nobility to live with him in, so that he could control them, so that he would constantly know what they were doing. And as I pointed out on Monday, one of the interesting ironies of that, of course, is that when we think of the Enlightenment, the philosophers who are considering the idea of limited government originate in France, and they're having these conversations about how the government is there for the people and how the people should be the ultimate controllers of what the government does. They're doing this in these parties where this absolute monarch is actually roaming around listening to them and finding their discussions quite amusing and tolerating them, but only to a point. Voltaire is excluded or is forced to leave France because of his ideas, because he becomes too popular and too outspoken on his ideas of individualism and politics. Um, but that's also going to lead him to travel around Europe and ultimately end up being one of the great confidants to Catherine the Great. This is also where we see the rise of Russia, Peter the Great, adopting a lot of Western European ideas, and he is what is referred to as an enlightened monarch, an absolute monarch, but an enlightened monarch, where he begins to see that, yeah, there is a responsibility of the rulers to the people, but he does not, like Catherine, he doesn't actually see the idea that the people should be involved in politics, because he thinks that the majority of people, particularly in Russia, are not educated enough. I don't want to say smart because they're smart, but they're not educated enough. They don't understand enough about the way things operate to be able to do that. So this is your big thing. Enlightened monarchs tend to be absolute monarchs, but they are absolute monarchs who are trying to apply Enlightenment principles to the way they govern. Among them, the most notable would be Peter, and then his granddaughter Catherine the Great, both of Russia, Maria Theresa of Austria, who is a great-granddaughter of Charles V. There will be others who are, again, adopting some of these Enlightenment ideas, but not going to the length of thinking about open elections or anything radical like that. Here's your expansion of Russia from 1462 to 1795. Basically starting with Russian territory in 1462, but the acquisitions, particularly under the Romanovs, are going to be the major ones to unify and take Russia all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Prussia, again, I mentioned them already. A lot of this coming out of their enlightened monarch, particularly Frederick II, um, who used their military as their mechanism for organizing their society. They're going to become one of the most militarized states. Um, their power in their army, but and a great amount of money spent on their army, but also on the technology to make their army um, one of the best, if not the best, in Europe. It's going to lead them to a very aggressive Prussian foreign policy in which they're going to begin the process of accumulating or beginning to control the local little principalities around them, building Prussia to become the centerpiece that will ultimately unify Germany in the latter 1800s. All right, so while you get the development of absolutism in Russia, France, Austria, Prussia, you get a counter drive for constitutionalism in England. English constitutionalism has a long history. It literally goes back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And if you have the great fortune of being able to go to Washington at any point in time in the Rotunda, where we have the original copy of the Declaration of Independence and the original copy of the Constitution, there is also a copy of the Magna Carta because we trace American constitutionalism back to English, through English constitutionalism back to the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta, or the large chart, or the big document, um, literally limited the power of the king. It was put in place in 1215 because King John, the John who didn't want to ransom his brother Richard the Lionhearted, um, was trying very hard to unify all of England under himself and to expand war during one of the big crusades. And his nobility had had enough of him. And so they basically met up with him and said, no, we're not going to war with you unless you stop unilaterally taxing us. That we have a right and our people have a right through us to determine how much they should be taxed. And this was kind of a pretty big deal at the time because this put limits on the power of the king. And from 1215 forward, it stops the ability of the king to do certain things. And this is one of the big things that um, both um, Charles the First and Charles the Second run up against when they are trying to return England to an absolute monarchy in the 1600s. So English constitutionalism, what effectively happens, I can take you through English constitutionalism. I encourage you to look at the 1600s. I think of it as a sort of Oreo in that you have the kings on the outside who are put in place um, by Parliament and by agreement with the Parliament to rule, versus the ones in the middle who are trying very hard to do away with Parliament. So what happens after Henry VII is, of course, that even though he manages to have 6 wives, he only manages through those 6 wives to have one son. And that son, Edward, dies at a young age, which kind of throws the monarchy and the succession of the monarchy into chaos. Now, unlike the French and the Spanish who adopted the Salic law, which basically meant that women couldn't inherit the throne, the English did not. So this allows the control of the kingdom to pass to Henry VII's daughters. But it also is part of what is foundational to understanding the religious wars in England, because his first daughter is, of course, the daughter of his first wife, who was Catholic. And even though he basically annulled that marriage when he did away, when he severed himself from the Roman Catholic Church, um, he later reinstates her as his illegitimate daughter. which means that she has the power to come to the throne after his son dies. He, of course, is dead already, so he's not there to have any influence on this. So Mary comes to the throne and immediately attempts to reinstitute Catholicism in England, which leads to some really bloody moments. There's a reason she's called Bloody Mary. She ultimately dies in childbirth, and that paves the way for Parliament to kind of take control again. And this time, they bring to the throne her sister Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is, of course, brought up as Protestant. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who, even though Anne herself was accused of treason and beheaded, um, Elizabeth spent her very young life, most of her life, learning to negotiate politics. Um, so Parliament puts her on the throne with the promise that she will allow England to remain Protestant, which she does. But in order to remain on the throne, she spends her entire life unmarried, because even though England doesn't have the Salic law, which would have prevented her from ruling, if she got married, her husband would become king. So throughout the course of her life, and she has a pretty long life, she doesn't die until she's in her 80s, she spends her life negotiating literally to remain single by courting different princes from different Catholic countries. Now, the reason for that is because the most powerful countries are, of course, Spain and France. And if she married anybody else, either one of them would go to war with her. So she courts different princes from there, courts them for like years, allowing them to come to court, giving them gifts and all that, but then ultimately rejecting them, because if she had married them, they would have had the power to convert England back to Catholicism. And this is also part of what leads to that brief period when England is at war with Spain, the War of the Spanish Armada, which England actually wins, which basically shows the rise of the English not only as a power politically in Europe, but also as a military power, because at this point in time, navies are the preeminent military force in Europe. They are protecting those ships that are bringing gold and silver from the Western Hemisphere to Spain and France and various other places. Um, Part of how she ends up going to war is because with Spain, it's because she has covertly been hiring privateers to go raid Spanish ships, and they do it under their own names and this sort of things to basically try to thwart the rising power of Spain and to get some of that money from the Western Hemisphere into England's coffers. It's under her that the first colonies, the colony at Roanoke that fails, Sir Walter Raleigh's colony, get established in the Western Hemisphere in hopes of finding gold for them. So it's under this period that, even though we think of England under Elizabeth as kind of being an absolute monarchy, it's still constitutional. Um, and because she's going to die without an heir, she has to negotiate literally with her next closest male relative, who is James VI of Scotland, who is Mary's son that was born, that basically the reason Mary died. So she goes to James, who has been raised Catholic, and says, all right, obviously we need you. And she doesn't go alone. She goes with members of Parliament. And they're like, you have a right to the throne as the next legitimate male heir, or heir, literally, regardless of gender. But you can't come in as a Protestant, as a Catholic. You can come in as a Protestant. You have to come in as a Protestant, at least in public. What you can do, though, is if you want to remain Catholic in your private quarters, if you want to have a priest on your staff in your private quarters, you can do this. But in public, you have to be the head of the English Protestant Church. And James, after some debate, agrees to this. So when Elizabeth dies in 1603, James I becomes the King of England, and he agrees to the stipulation. And it's under him that we actually get the King James Bible, the first translation of the Bible into English. It's also under him that we see more of the colonies develop in the Western Hemisphere. James has an interesting reign. I won't go into a lot of the details of that. The textbooks do that pretty well enough. But when he dies, he is succeeded by his oldest son, Charles the First. And Charles does not agree with his father's policy. He thinks that there is no reason whatsoever why England shouldn't be returned to Catholicism. It probably helps that Charles's queen is French. So he sets out on a policy of trying to uh, return England to Catholicism. And one of the first things he does, which he can do, is to suspend Parliament. But then he has to try to make everything operate on the money that he has from the revenues that have already been established. He can't raise revenues. And he tries, and they're protested. And this eventually leads to the conflict. That and the fact that Parliament intercepts letters between him and Louis XIV in France, in which Louis basically promises to send armies to help bolster him. They arrest Charles the First, accuse him of treason, and under the Parliament run by Oliver Cromwell, who is effectively a Puritan, Charles is beheaded. And we get literally a period in time from effectively 1649 to around 1663 of what is called the Cromwellian dictatorship. This is a period when Cromwell, by controlling the military, basically operates everything. And it's a really difficult time in England because the Puritans are very Puritan. We'll just go with that. Um, you can only wear black, white, and gray. Nobody can wear jewelry. Nobody can wear anything that's a color. Men have to keep their hair tied back. Women have to keep their heads covered. You're only allowed out during daylight hours. You have to attend church daily, um, and the churches are Puritan churches. And rolls are taken. If you miss church on a day, somebody from the church comes to your house to find out why you missed church. I mean, it's literally a theocracy, and one of the worst kinds of theocracy. So when Cromwell dies in 1661, his son attempts to take over for him, but he doesn't have Cromwell's popularity, which is kind of hard to believe because Cromwell wasn't really that popular. But he can't hold Parliament together. So effectively, the dictatorship collapses. The less radical factions of Parliament take control, and they look to Charles II, who has been the brother, or Charles II, the son of Charles I, who has spent his time in France. They go to him and they say, all right, look, we're going to offer you the same deal we offered your father, your grandfather, James I. You can come be King of England, but you have to agree to our stipulations. Well, Charles II is interesting. He doesn't even speak English. He's spoken French the entire time, most of his youth, because he fled with his mother to France after his father was beheaded. Um, but he's been living on the largesse of the French court. So he agrees to this. So he goes back. He basically becomes king. This is called the Restoration. And one of the great things about the Restoration period is that he does away with all those puritanical laws, so that this is the period when theaters and corner pubs reopen, gambling is permitted again. It's a period of jubilation, literally, in much of England, and some of that spreads into the Western Hemisphere, where the colonies, many of the colonies that were founded not by Puritans but by British companies, find that they can return to being the way they want to be. Um, so this opens up again. This kind of once again reinforces the limits of the power of the king. Charles lives for 30 years or so as the king. In this time period, he dabbles with trying to convert England back to Catholicism, but he's too much of a libertine. He doesn't actually want to go to the lengths of doing anything that would get him beheaded. But when he dies, even though he has a tremendous number of illegitimate offspring, he does not have a legitimate heir. His French princess did not give him a legitimate heir that lived into adulthood. So the throne passes to his brother, James II. And now I see the Oreo here, James I, Charles I, Cromwell in the middle, then Charles II, James II. James II only rules for about 3 years because he makes the tragic error of attempting to do what Charles II, his father, had done. He attempts to basically sanction France to launch an invasion into England to restore Catholicism. And Parliament gets wind of this. James himself is warned that Parliament's coming to arrest him, like they did his father. So he flees to the coast and boards a boards a ship, back to France, where he spends the rest of his very short life. But at the end of this, Parliament once more is forced to have to figure out who to bring in. This time they bring in William and Mary, Mary being James II's daughter, but she is married to William of Orange of the Netherlands. William is basically the Protestant champion of Western Europe. The armies of Orange have managed to keep much of the Netherlands independent of the control of both France and Spain. He is he is Louis XIV's nemesis, to the point that apparently if anybody says William of Orange's name in Louis's presence, Louis would have a tantrum. I mean, he was thwarting him all over the place. So this basically brings in a new constitutional monarch to England. And it's interesting also in the fact that it is under the return of William and Mary, or the return of the monarchy under William and Mary, that even more restraints are put on the power of the king. One of their principal political advisors is John Locke, who had been expelled from England under the reign of James II. He returns to England and then later on becomes one of the founding members of the Carolina colony. And it's under him that we get this idea that monarchs and rulers are definitely put in place at the will of the people, not to lord over the people. So it is under William and Mary that we get the declaration, where we get the rights of men under the Englishmen that will become foundational to all of the colonies in the Western Hemisphere by the time we get to effectively the 1700s, by the time we get to the foundation of many of the colonies that will become part of the revolution of the British colonies against Britain in 1776. So yeah, this is your evolution of constitutionalism in England. It's very important that you understand this because it's definitely tied up with the religious wars. It's definitely tied up with the Enlightenment. It is definitely tied up with the development of economics in the Enlightenment as well. All right, this last page that I have, these are video supplements, and they're all as part of, well, all except one. The very last one is The Renaissance, Was It a Thing? From Crash Course World History number 22, but all the rest of them are from Crash Course European History. And it's a really excellent series. It's going to bring up a lot of these ideas, but also bring up a lot of historiographic ideas that you should consider when we're talking about how all of these movements work to put Europe at center stage, so that coming out of the 1700s, Europeans had the foundation, particularly the British, the French, and the Dutch, to expand into the rest of the world and take over. And a big part of this has to do with these Enlightenment ideas that are going to get us into Enlightenment economics, the shift from mercantilism to capitalism, Enlightenment science, which is going to give them literally the scientific and military abilities to defeat other parts of the world militarily, gunpowder being a big one, and gunpowder weapons being a big one. And also the issues of expanding Christianity, whether it be in the form of Protestantism or Catholicism, and how that's going to play in the building of these European empires. So all of these are very central to what we're talking about. All right, on that note, obviously I should have stopped a long time ago. I'm going to stop. I encourage you to look through this PowerPoint and to listen to this video, obviously, and to look through these videos. I think I've hit on the big ones, but certainly there are other ones that I didn't include because this is a really complex period in European history. Um, and I encourage you, like I skipped from number 8, no, number 7, Reformation and Consequences, to number 12, the Scientific Revolution, from 12 to 18, the Enlightenment. The ones between those are really significant as well. So I encourage you to look at those also. All right. I will see you in class on Monday where we will talk about intellectualism and the big points of your discussions as well. And also a reminder that fourth, primary source analysis, please get me your primary sources by Saturday.